The New York Rangers are definitely a team that I would expect to be very active this offseason as they look to make lots of moves, whether that's, via free agency, signing players, or possibly trading for some players as well. With the ultimate goal, of course, to try and make this team a whole lot better than what it was from this past season, as the Rangers had a pretty disappointing overall season there, start to finish. Things did not go as planned for the Rangers as they ended up missing playoffs after previously making 2 of the last 3 Eastern Conference Finals, and of course, last season losing in the conference finals in Game 6 to the eventual Stanley Cup champions. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at some kind of trade news and kind of stuff like that here in today's video, as we have 6 destinations for a potential Alexis Lafreniere trade. And it's not to say that I think Lafreniere is a guy who must be traded away, but I thought this was an interesting article to kind of take a look at here, which involves a New York Rangers player who has some pretty good trade value, I'd imagine there, who has been someone who's been kind of talked about quite a bit amongst fans about possibly being, dealt away after having a pretty disappointing season after signing that massive extension. So let's take a look at 6 teams in today's video that could possibly, make some sense for the Rangers to trade Alexis Lafreniere to this offseason if they ultimately want to do that. Getting into the article here, they end up saying, quote, "The New York Rangers struggled mightily in 2024-25, and with their new head coach in Mike Sullivan, they're looking to turn things around very quickly moving forward and get back to Stanley Cup contention. To do so, they may be looking to target an upgrade in their forward group, and unsurprisingly, that has brought Alexis Lafreniere's name up in trade conversations once again heading into the summer." They also go on to say, "That's a discussion that's been had many times in recent years, and now Bleacher Report have identified this group of teams as the ones to look out for in potentially acquiring Lafreniere this summer." And they go on to list the Calgary Flames, Montreal Canadiens, Anaheim Ducks, Chicago Blackhawks, the newly Utah Mammoth, of course, and the Minnesota Wild. So now let's go basically team by team here and kind of take a look and see if there actually is a reasonable kind of target for this Rangers team to acquire that could actually be a possible upgrade, kind of like I've been talking about, in which, if the only kind of way I really think it makes sense for this team to trade away Lafreniere is, of course, if you're getting a real upgrade, and even they say that in this article as well. So let's go team by team here, from Calgary all the way down to Minnesota through this list and kind of see which teams actually have a kind of realistic target that would be an upgrade over Lafreniere. And first off here, we got the Calgary Flames, who, I'm going to be honest, don't really have a realistic or kind of good target to kind of swap with Alexis Lafreniere. You take a look at their top forwards, you got a guy like Nazem Kadri, but with his contract, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to add in another guy who's making around that kind of $8 million range, just like guys like Zibanejad and, of course, JT Miller, RDR, 2 aging kind of guys. Adding in another one like that, to me, just probably isn't the best idea, so I don't think that's a very realistic target. Then you've got Jonathan Huberdeau, who again has a pretty massive contract. Don't see that happening there. Then they have a pretty kind of good young forward in Matt Coronado there, who is kind of young as well, like Lafreniere, but I just don't think is a real upgrade necessarily over Lafreniere. So in my opinion, they really just don't have a forward that would be a direct upgrade. Of course, they've got Mackenzie Weegar, but I can't imagine they're necessarily looking to trade him. So really and truly, there isn't just a kind of guy on this roster that really kind of jumps out at me and says that that would be a direct kind of upgrade for this Rangers team. Guy like Connor Zary could be interesting, but really and truly, there isn't kind of one of those guys that jumps off the page for this Calgary Flames team. But now for the Montreal Canadiens, who unfortunately, again, I would kind of say you're not really going to be able to get that direct kind of upgrade realistically. I mean, you're not getting a guy like a Nick Suzuki, a Cole Caulfield. You're not getting a Uri Slavkovsky. They're not trading away Lane Hudson. The next guy after that for the forward side of things there is like Brendan Gallagher, who is an aging guy who has still a pretty decent-sized contract. So that's not a realistic target. Doesn't make sense for the Rangers. And then after that, you've got Patrick Laine, who personally, I'm just not trading Lafreniere for Laine. To me, that makes absolutely kind of no sense. And now for the Anaheim Ducks, who are a pretty interesting team as they have quite a few kind of good young NHL players on their roster right now. First off, of course, you've got Troy Terry, who was their points leader from this past season. Pretty solid forward, but just not quite sure he's the exact kind of guy you'd be kind of using in a trade for Lafreniere from either side. I'm sure both sides very well might end up saying no to that. It's definitely a possibility. Then you've got Mason McTavish, who, really good young center. I would love to see a trade happen like this where we see kind of, Lafreniere dealt out for McTavish, although I'm not sure quite how realistic it possibly is. But if something like that were to happen, I'd be quite happy with that. I think adding in a good young center like McTavish for Lafreniere in some kind of package could make some sense. He's definitely one of those kind of type of players who I think it makes sense in a kind of, swap deal or swap package. With involving kind of like Lafreniere, of course, going out the door. Then you got Frank Vetrano, who just doesn't make sense to trade, Lafreniere for. Leo Carlson, there's not even a point in talking about that. The Anaheim Ducks will just not even consider that. Same thing with Cutter Gauthier there, who's also another kind of really good young forward. He would not be in the deal for Lafreniere more than likely. Then you've got Jackson Lacombe, a pretty good, young, kind of promising defenseman. I doubt the Anaheim Ducks are really looking to move him. And then you've got three players in Ryan Strome, Alex Killorn, and Trevor Zegras, who I just think all three of them aren't necessarily guys who I'd be targeting if I'm the Rangers, as Killorn and Strome are two kind of a bit of older kind of players. And then you've got Zegras, who I just don't think is the type of player who I want to see added to this New York Rangers team. Next up here, you've got the Chicago Blackhawks, and obviously, first off, Connor Bedard, not going to have that conversation because it's not realistic. Then you got Ryan Donato, who is a UFA this offseason, so he's obviously a free agent. Then you've got Teuvo Teravainen, who I just don't think would make a whole lot of sense to be swapping, obviously, a guy like Lafreniere for. Tyler Bertuzzi, of course, same kind of thing. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to, trade Lafreniere for a guy like that. Nick Foligno, same thing. Ilya Mikheyev, not good enough. So after that, the kind of roster just kind of falls off a bit into some of the younger kind of guys who aren't even that great at this moment. So personally, the Chicago Blackhawks are also, once again, kind of not really a team that makes a whole lot of sense for me to kind of deal Lafreniere over to, unless you're using some different assets or those kind of assets to go out there and make that direct kind of, buy now move where you're just kind of trading him away to open up a lot of cap space to go spend massive in free agency. Like, that's really the only way I'm dealing away Lafreniere to one of these teams, because you're not really getting that actual kind of, big upgrade that this team actually kind of needs if they're looking to trade away a guy like Lafreniere. Next up here, we've got the Utah Mammoth, of course, now, and I do like their name. I think it's pretty cool, but carrying on, though, and taking a look at their actual team, Clayton Keller is, of course, not a player on the discussion list. Same thing with Logan Cooley, and I would imagine Nick Schmaltz as well, and same thing with Dylan Guenther. Then you've got defenseman Mikhail Sergachev. Again, I can't imagine would be up for trade. Then you've got Barrett Hayton, who I think maybe some kind of a deal could happen there where you're sending over Lafreniere for Barrett Hayton. Maybe that's a possibility. I think something like that could make a bit of sense there, both around, I would say, somewhat similar value possibly, and maybe the Rangers are getting back a little more. I'd kind of possibly hope maybe a little bit, but either way, I think that's honestly somewhat of a fairly close deal there. Then you've got some other solid kind of players, but nothing after that kind of jumps out. So Barrett Hayton is maybe a decent kind of possible kind of realistic trade option there if the Rangers were to do a deal with the Utah Mammoth. I would imagine a guy like Barrett Hayton definitely could be involved in that deal. So other than that, though, not a ton of targets, as some of their top guys are definitely just not even in debatable kind of trade talks there. Then you've got the Minnesota Wild, who, unfortunately, kind of the same thing with a lot of these teams there. I just don't think have a lot of the right and realistic assets to make a deal for Lafreniere. Because like I said, assuming you're not looking to just kind of open up some cap space or get a bunch of picks or prospects, and you want an actual kind of real upgradable piece, a lot of these teams either have these kind of young guys who are around the age of Lafreniere, who you're obviously not going to trade Lafreniere for like a 35-year-old kind of guy on like a 2 or 3 year deal. So you want a kind of guy around Lafreniere's age, and most of those guys are either not quite at his level or way above his level, and they're just not realistic to trade for. So it's kind of tough to really kind of pick out the right kind of guys there. So that's why I think a guy like Barrett Hayton, who's around that kind of age there, who's around that kind of level, I think could make some sense there if the Rangers were to make a trade with the Utah Mammoth, although I have no idea whether or not they're really looking to trade away a guy like Barrett Hayton. Next up here, like I said, the Minnesota Wild, they've got some solid players, but again, it's a lot of guys who I think might be a little too above Lafreniere or too below him to actually kind of make that realistic trade, unless there is going to be a package deal, the Rangers are kind of, making for one of these guys. But most of these guys who I'm talking about, who I would want to see Lafreniere traded for with a package around him, are more likely these guys who these teams want to hold on to, like a Matt Boldy, like more likely a Marco Rossi, of course, like a Kirill Kaprizov. That's not happening. And obviously a guy like Matt Zuccarello, he'd be cool to bring back at some point, I guess. But really and truly, you're not trading Lafreniere for him. Frederick Gaudreau there, obviously not quite good enough there. Marcus Johansson, way too old, not near that value. So to me, there's really not any guys on this Minnesota Wild team that make a whole lot of sense unless it was for Marco Rossi, which I'm not sure they'd be looking to really trade him away. Although if they were, I'd absolutely be interested to kind of talk about a kind of Marco Rossi, Lafreniere kind of deal there, whether or not the Rangers would probably have to add on another piece or two, I'd imagine, whether it's pick or prospect wise, but something like that, I think it'd be pretty incredible for this team to add in a guy like Rossi, although to me, like I said, I just don't know how realistic that truly actually is. Anyways, that's going to pretty much do it for today's video. If you have enjoyed, definitely don't forget to click that like and subscribe button for daily New York Rangers content. And as always, definitely don't forget to comment down below your thoughts, especially on today's video. Do you want to see Lafreniere traded away? Do you think it makes sense? Do you think it's realistic? And kind of what package do you think makes sense to come back? Do you think it would be for a kind of direct kind of one-for-one swap almost for someone, like a Marco Rossi type there who's, around Lafreniere's age, who's around that kind of skill level, who's also a forward? Let me know your thoughts on that. Let me know your thoughts on some of these trade destinations as well. I'll catch you next one, and let's go Rangers.